unidentified flying object.
Researcher on a mission with Dr. J Andy Ilias.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Welcome back to another episode of Researchers on a Mission, ROAM Radio. I'm your host, Dr. J, and co-hosting with me straight from the UK is Johnny Webb. Welcome, Johnny.
Good evening, Dr. J. It's good to be back with you on Researchers on a Mission, and I'm really looking forward to our next guest this evening. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. And as usual, this is going to be an amazing show for you today and a truly international show for you today. Not only do we have myself in America, specifically Southern California, we have Johnny Webb live in London, but we also have who I like to call the godfather of ufology. That's what he's known as, but what I like to personally call is Stan the Man Friedman. Mr. Friedman, welcome to the show live in Canada.
Good evening. Yes, it is live here in Canada.
It's always a pleasure to speak to you. You are literally a walking encyclopedia of knowledge, probably the longest running history of researching this topic. You're in your 57th year, if I'm not mistaken, right now?
Yeah.
And nobody can really say that that's walking around this earth right now and still give me.
Because I'm older than everybody. What do you think?
and just to add that actually might bring in the first thing. You are the only ufologist still going around today that actually testified when there were real Senate hearings in 1968. Is that correct?
Now, it wasn't Senate now. It was Congress, and I wasn't there in person. I submitted something in writing. Written thing, which is included in the proceedings, but I wasn't down in Washington, unfortunately.
Well, I'm glad you corrected me on that, because actually I was hoping you could explain for everybody out there who many of the people, including me, weren't even alive when that occurred. How did it all start? Who initiated it? How did you get involved?
Almost the entire impetus came from Dr. James E. McDonnell, a professor of physics at the University of Arizona. Specialty was atmospheric physics, and as you know, most UFOs are seen in the atmosphere. So it makes sense. He got interested in the early 60s, investigated over 500 cases, a really good guy, a sharp investigator. And he used to stop by Pittsburgh once in a while on his way from Washington back to Arizona or other places he was going. And I was very active in a group in Pittsburgh, UFO Research Institute of Pittsburgh. And Jim let us sell some of his papers, so we had some research funding. We had a phone number anybody could call 24 hours a day. And Jim was pushing on the hearings, and I had a congressman who was on that committee. I mean, there was a congressman from Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, and Somehow I was asked if I was interested in submitting a paper, and I said yes. So, and I understand the proceedings of the Symposium on Unidentified Flying Objects, July 29th, 1968, which just happens to be my birthday. I wasn't born in 68. July 29th is my birthday. Anyway, so I got asked by that local congressman. His letter is, his comment is in the proceedings. And Jim, everybody else, all the 12 people total, 6 in person and 6 more of us in writing, all but me, they all had PhDs. And I was the youngest of the group, but as far as I know, I'm the only one still alive. There were people like Dr. J. Allen Hynek, my Chicago classmate Carl Sagan, Dr. Donald Menzel, we'll talk more about him, gave a written paper as well. Dr. James Harder from the University of California, guy in sociology at the University of Illinois, Chicago campus, Dick Hall's brother, and there were several other people, in other words, and they were all sharp guys. And the hearings, what can I say? The proceedings are one of the documents that I recommend to people. I normally talk about 5 large-scale scientific studies, and when you get testimony from 12 scientists in one volume, it's really something special, especially when people tell you there is no scientific data. The only people who tell you that are people who haven't looked at the scientific data and don't want to look at the scientific data. You know, basic rule for debunkers, don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up. And I just read, would you believe today, I was looking for something else and under NSA, and I ran across a Russian paper from 1960s in which the guy sounded just like the debunkers sounded here. Got everything wrong in what he said about UFO sightings. It was incredible. Only seen by people who want to believe in them. They're never seen on radar. They're never seen by pilots. It was an incredibly typical bunch of nonsense. So the Congressional hearings symposium is well worth reading for anybody who wants to know, is there really any data about this stuff? I won't say everything that was said was true. Some of the people hadn't done their homework, like Carl Sagan. And, you know, Carl is an interesting example. We went to school in the same classes at the University of Chicago for 3 years. Same age, grew up in adjacent towns in New Jersey. Didn't know each other in high school, but right afterward. And he has said on occasion, to typify the approach of the debunkers, that there are interesting sightings that aren't reliable. There are reliable sightings that aren't interesting, but there are no interesting and reliable sightings. Now, he said that a couple of times in books. And the trouble is, he gives no reference, no source, and it's total baloney. The largest study ever done of flying saucers, Project Blue Book Special Report number 14, had data on 3,201 sightings, and they found that exactly the opposite was true. That is, the more reliable the sightings were rated as excellent, good, doubtful, and poor. The more reliable the sightings, the more likely to be unexplainable. Overall, 21.5% couldn't be explained. Of the excellent sightings, 35% couldn't be explained. So that's the typical kind of stuff you get from people doing their research by proclamation rather than investigation. And I'm a believer in investigation. I've been to 20 archives. When I want to get more information, I go after it. You know, where can we find out more? It's kind of, I'm very much involved still in these Majestic 12 controversy. And I get so sick of people declaiming about it. For example, one of the craziest things in the MJ-12 EBD Eisenhower briefing document was that it says one of the members of this Majestic 12 group was Dr. Donald Menzel. Now, he was a Harvard astronomer who wrote 3 anti-UFO books with the silliest explanations. He didn't go for witness testimony. He was sure people were lousy witnesses. And I could never understand. Here was an outstanding astronomer, I mean, we're talking Harvard now, who was saying silly things. Well, one of the strange things about the MJ-12 document received at the end of 1984 was that it said Menzel was a member of this group of 12 people who knew all about UFOs, knew about Roswell bodies, et cetera, et cetera. How could that be? Well, I thought it must be a fraud because somebody's trying to get us to stand up in public and they can say, gotcha, you know, here, I faked that document. Well, one of the people on the list was somebody I was sure would have been involved, was Dr. Vannevar Bush, who was basically President Roosevelt's science advisor, ran a committee that handled 80 or 90 big technology projects, including the Manhattan Project, atomic bombs, radar, proximity fuse, all kinds of things. And I was looking at the Bush papers, some of them in Library of Congress Manuscript Division, and there was a letter to him from a lawyer in Boston, thanking him for his testimony at hearings that helped get Dr. Menzel off the hook. They were trying to take away his security clearance, his secret Air Force clearance, because he was disloyal to the United States. This was the time of the McCarthy era, and stuff like that. And so that got my interest, because why would somebody who's teaching astronomy at Harvard need a security clearance? That didn't make any sense. All the other people, all the other 11, clearly had high-level security clearances. 3 of them were directors of CIA at one time or another. Others were generals, admirals, etc. All, you could just tell from the work that they did during the war, had high-level clearances. But how could Menzel fit? Well, okay, I saw this letter from a lawyer. I called the lawyer. He says, oh, yeah, there are over 1,000 pages at the Harvard archives. All these guys were dead, so how convenient, and no way to ask, is this really you? Were you on this committee? And so I had to get permission from 3 different people. I got a research grant from the Fund for UFO Research, but I couldn't see Menzel's papers until the 3 people said it was okay, in writing, mind you. And I went up there and discovered, to my total shock, because I didn't like him. He was a debunker. He said silly things. And it turns out he wrote to Jack Kennedy, who was on the board of overseers at Harvard, and his area of interest was astronomy, that Menzel, there was one area he could help him with. This is in late 1960. And that was with regard to the National Security Agency. NSA, never says anything, no such agency, whatever people want to call it.
10 times
That's
bigger than CIA.
Well, yeah, Mr. Snowden's organization, you can say. I guess he's in Russia still, I think. I don't know where he is. But anyway, I was so shocked by that letter, and I kept reading. There was an unpublished autobiography, and it turns out Menzel was into cryptography. He taught cryptographers at the beginning of the war. He was up to his ears for the Office of Naval Intelligence, doing work, figuring out communications so that you could trap submarines or figure out where they were and stuff like that, all kinds of stuff. Nobody knew any of this stuff. And that he taught cryptography was incredible. So what I'm saying is, I didn't just say, oh, it can't be, as some people are saying. I went and looked for evidence, and to my shock, discovered it. It's funny, I found a colleague of his who didn't know about this stuff, but I asked him, how do you think Menzel would feel? He knew all about Roswell bodies and all this sort of stuff, and he was playing the debunker role. And his answer shocked me. He said, he would have loved it. What do you mean? Well, he knew he was smarter than everybody else anyway. It just would confirm it. He knew and they didn't know. So what I'm saying is you got to go after the evidence. The same with Roswell. I looked for people, found them. It was the first to find a whole bunch of people involved in Roswell. But you don't get it by sitting at home and saying it can't be, that's too wild a story, it never could have happened, blah, blah, blah. So I'm a believer in, well, I just put together a list of, 11 claims that people have made about the 3 documents that I say are genuine MJ-12 documents, where they say, oh no, because. And I've shown that none of these stand up. Well, a typical example, it may be a silly one, but one of the documents, it says the security marking is top secret restricted. Now, both the Eisenhower Library and the Library of Congress Manuscript Division said, oh, that wasn't in use until the Nixon era. This is a document dated 1952, really. And when I'm reading a big 400-page report by the General Accounting Office, it says that they were out someplace looking for documents about Roswell. There was a big effort to find more documents. And we didn't find anything about Roswell at these facilities that had material up to top secret. But we did find several instances of the use of top secret restricted, even though we had been told that it was not in use. We found
the irony behind that is they're going to tell you they're not going to use it, but yet they've probably been using it for decades, and that's the whole point of having security clearance. Before I go back to some of your major points, I know Johnny had a question for you. Go ahead, Johnny.
Okay. Johnny?
Friedman. Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, you were saying that you've done research, over 50 different, research studies, and you said that you're continually looking for new information. What is the newest information that's come to light that you've, undulved?
Well, I suppose more about Dr. Menzel. I found an article in a journal called Cryptologia, I guess it is, pretty fancy, where the contributions of Donald Menzel to what's the fancy term here? I'm got to get the title right. To computer, basically, it's to cryptanalysis, breaking codes and stuff like that. And here's a 30-some page article in a professional magazine about all the contributions he made to cryptanalysis. That's besides all the other stuff he did while in the Navy. But it's got all kinds of detail. He was real up to his ears in this stuff, and nobody knew it. There are two example of that. There are two special issues of Sky and Telescope magazine devoted to Donald Menzel. One on the time of his death, 1976, and one the 100th anniversary of his birth, 2001. And they go on and on about all the wonderful things he did in astronomy, which is true. He had a remarkable record. Probably saw more eclipses than anybody, for example. He did research on eclipses. Neither one of these mentions his post-World War II highly classified research. It's as if it didn't exist. And people have tried to use that. Absence of evidence is evidence for absence. It doesn't say anything there about it, so it must not have been. And I find that aggravating. None of the people who've given me a hard time about that have gone to the Harvard archives to look for themselves. They're sure it couldn't have been, that this debunker could have led two lives. Well, you Brits have three guys. What was it, Burgess, Philby, and McLean? The infamous trio that were Russian spies but worked for British intelligence. Or shouldn't I bring that up? It doesn't sound good.
No, it's fine.
But you know what I'm saying. These guys led double lives for a lot of years. You got to be very careful when you're a spy working for two masters, so to speak. So that's the latest thing, is that I found this article that it was done several years ago, but I'm not a subscriber to the journal Cryptologia. And nobody else had mentioned it. But I found it, and even talked to the author, and we'll
the files that the files that have been encrypted, or the encryption technology that this man was using, was he using it against Germans like the Enigma, or was it internal American documents?
No, he was working to help break the codes, the German codes, and also he learned Japanese so he could work on those codes. He learned to read it and so forth. He was a pretty good linguist anyway. So it was part of the, first it was actually the Office of Naval Intelligence then, and then the NSA took over. I mean, when you tell somebody like Kennedy, you've got more experience with the NSA than anybody else, that's pretty powerful stuff. And when we are properly cleared to each other, I can tell you more. This is what he's telling the man who was just elected president.
And more on Menzel. I remember when I first saw the first documentary where you explained that when you got the list of MJ-12, the members, and he was on there, and it just blew your mind. You're like, how could he be one of the members when he's a debunker? It just fit my mind perfectly that this is the exact person that, in theory, that they would use when they have a program that ridicules, debunks, destroys characters.
Yes.
Exactly.
I say that now.
And it's also very similar to Heinrich, isn't it? Using, in his early days, he was a debunker, swamp gas theories, and then later on he came out with his own understandings of it.
Well, yeah, Alan was working for the government. He didn't want to jeopardize his position. And the interesting thing, his reaction, I had talked to General Carol Bolender, the Air Force general, who was asked in 1969, after the University of Colorado study recommended that Project Blue Book be closed. It was supposedly the only American government-sponsored group working on UFO sightings. And in 69, Bolender had no previous connection with UFOs. He was an engineer working on the Lunar Excursion Module. And this was right after we landed on the moon. So as he put it to me, I talked to him. I'm the only one I know that has. 10 years later, we didn't see this memo. It was declassified until 10 years later. I asked him about that. His recommendation, well, let me quote. He said, reports of UFOs which could affect national security are not part of the Blue Book system. They're made in accordance with JNAP, Joint Army Navy Air Force Publication 146, or Air Force Manual 55-11, and are not part of the Blue Book system. And then that's an astonishing statement, you understand, because we're told all the time that Blue Book was the only group that was working on UFOs. Well, except for the important cases, the ones that could affect national security is what this says. And he also says, 2 paragraphs later, if we close Project Blue Book, the public won't have a place to report UFO sightings. However, as previously noted, reports which could affect national security will continue to be investigated using the procedures established for that purpose. Now, those are 2 incredible statements. Well, I found out once I saw this 10 years after the document was written, I managed to locate General Bolender. He's dead now, so you can't interview him, unfortunately. But and I told him, I said, look, I had a security clearance for 14 years. I'm very interested in this subject. I read your memo with interest. It seems to me you're saying that there were 2 separate channels for reporting UFO sightings. One for the ones that could affect national security, and I used an example. I said, suppose a saucer goes down the runway at a Strategic Air Command base where there are nuclear weapons stored. That's clearly a matter of national security. It's not supposed to be at that base. Nothing, other than people with clearances. And the other is, if my wife and I go out to the house and see a saucer flying over, big deal. One channel for those and one for the other ones. And he said yes. And it makes sense. In other words, if you got military pilots chasing UFOs, they don't report to the press. They report upstairs, so to speak. They have a command structure that they go through. And the exciting cases would be multiple witness radar visual sightings, for example, that sort of thing. And nobody I know has a radar set, to check on aircraft going overhead. So when you look at that, when I gave a copy of that memo to Alan Hynek, it was at a MUFON conference, Mutual UFO Network in California, and he looked at it, and later he said they were playing games with him. This clearly said that the good stuff didn't go through Project Blue Book, and he was Project Blue Book scientific consultant. So he felt very shocked and disturbed and distressed. He was a puppet. They were playing games with him.
That just goes to prove right there that, again, that the government, A, is lying, and B, just like you said, that the best cases were kept out of the public. So on one hand, they're saying everything is being investigated under Project Blue Book, but by the way, the ones that don't have enough information or are too mysterious don't even count, A. And just so you know, we're not telling you this now, but later on, the better cases are not even in this network. I mean, what does that tell everybody? It obviously tells people there's substance there.
Well, there's a massive cover-up going on. Well, you can tell it from another direction. The National Security Agency at first withheld the documents that the CIA said the NSA had. We brought a legal action against the CIA under Freedom of Information. And they first said they had nothing, and then a judge said, do a search, gentlemen. And then, oh, look what we found. Here's 900 pages of material. Of course, it was only up through secret. And, oh, yeah, here's a list of 57 other documents from other agencies, but we can't release them. You got to go to those other agencies. Well, as it turns out, later on in time, we pushed the NSA, which had some of those documents, and they finally admitted that they had 156 pages of National Security Agency top secret documents. At first, they wouldn't release any sources and methods information. We cannot release that by law, they pronounced. And then President Clinton signed a new executive order, 12958, which made it tougher to keep old stuff classified. And so they finally decided they'd release these. Well, in a special form, 156 pages on which you can read one sentence. Everything else was whited out, not blacked out, whited out. And I found out the reason for the whiteout when I had heard that they were releasing more, and I called the NSA. And, yeah, they will be releasing more, and they mentioned that this was all whited out. And they asked for my name and address, and I gave them. She said, oh, I know who you are. And that shocked me. Why does the NSA know who I am? And it turns out that Philip Klass, a debunker,
Yes.
had told him that I show the blacked-out justification to a federal court judge from the NSA for not releasing these documents on television and get lots of laughs because it was 80% blacked out.
Or more. Some of them were more. You just saw the date and the page number. Yeah.
Yeah, and so the reason they were whiting them out is because Phil Klass had called them and told them that Freeman doesn't tell them it's sources and methods information. Well, of course I do, but don't tell me it's 98% sources and methods and 1% or 2% UFOs. That makes no sense. So it you know, anybody who says there's no cover-up, well, except for all that stuff that you can't read from the NSA, and the CIA finally got around. I pushed them about their top-secret materials, and they finally released a bunch of those. They were almost all blacked out. I mean, you can read 6 words on this page, 8 words on that page. One says, deny in toto. They couldn't find 6 words on the page to release, to declassify, which is pretty silly, of course, but still, that's the way it is. So when people tell me, well, the government's not covering anything up, Stan, they don't know how to cover things up. There are a lot of programs that prove they know how to cover things up. And, you know, you've got a place in England, Bletchley Park. During World War II, that was the center for where they picked up German military communications. They'd broken the codes, the Enigma stuff, and they intercepted, then they decoded, translated, and very cautiously released as appropriate, because they didn't want the Germans to know they'd broken the code, because then they'd change it, then we'd be in trouble. And now you'd think that story, what a tremendous triumph this was for the free world, which it was, would have made news as soon as the war was over. Oh, no. More than 25 years later, before that was released, that story, and there were 12,000 people at Bletchley Park, none of whom talked during those 25 years, even though the war was over. Incidentally, one of the reasons for not releasing the story was that there were countries still using the German codes and machines, and we were reading their mail too. Didn't want them to know that. But people say secrets can't be kept. That's baloney. I mean, I've worked under security. I know secrets can be kept. And the funny thing is, you usually hear about these when the programs are over, finished. Like the first American spy satellite was the Corona spy satellite, which just happens to be the name of the small town nearest to where the Roswell incident took place. Corona! It's also Castro Cigars. What can I say? Anyway, the U-2 had been done in secret, reconnaissance plane, and then Khrushchev shot it down, and we lied about it at first. Blown off course, just an unfortunate storm. And then Khrushchev showed the pictures of the pilot and the cameras. And then I'll give Ike credit. He stood up and said, yes, it is a spy plane. We need to know what this secret society is doing. You know, one Pearl Harbor is quite enough, thank you. Well, the Corona spy satellite, they had 12 failures in a row, in secret, and then the 13th one worked and got more data about Soviet military installations, because, you know, it keeps going around and round and round and round, than all the U-2 flights combined. Now, when did we talk about that? 30 years later. So when people say secrets can't be kept, well, until they're released, you know. But right now, since the government clearly still has a policy of withholding information about UFOs, think Roswell, Aztec, you know, things like that, crashes, until the program is declassified, which it certainly hasn't been, we're not going to hear about that data. So anybody who tells me, well, I can't find any evidence that there is an MJ-12 group, why would one expect to?
You hit the nail on the head for me. Exactly. If a secret is still being perpetuated, then you wouldn't expect it to be known. Like you mentioned, the Corona satellite, 30 years after it's terminated, now we're talking about it. The Manhattan Project, after we detonated nuclear weapons, especially over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of course, people knew about it, but during the time, it was a highly guarded secret. But now we have this cosmic Watergate, and it's still going on. So why would people say that we can't keep secrets when obviously they're keeping the
They want to believe it, I think. We like to think we live in a world, especially in the world's greatest democracy, where we know what's going on. Our government trusts us. It tells us everything. The problem is that you can't tell your friends without telling your enemies.
It's true.
I mean, you think there aren't spies reading newspapers, listening to the radio, whatever? People act as if you could selectively somehow make sure that the good guys heard the message and the bad guys didn't. There is no way to do that. We just found out, I guess, that there were spies in Cuba who've been there for decades, serving the United States. And there were Cuban spies in the United States serving Castro for decades. So, and there are plenty of other programs. Operation Solarium, for example. Have you heard of that?
I haven't, no.
Well, right after I came into office in January of '53, he wanted a reevaluation of our defense situation. The Cold War was in full swing, and we knew he was informed that well, the scariest document I've ever seen was a declassified National Security Council meeting document from 1951, in which it was mentioned that the Russians had made more progress in the development of nuclear weapons and methods for delivering them in the past 18 months than had been expected for 5 years. That's pretty scary stuff, because we didn't have a big radar network in the United States. What do we need one for? The Russians don't have a big airplane. They had kept one of our B-29s that had been left there for some reason during the war, and they duplicated it, made a Chinese copy of an American plane in Russia, if you will. And so Ike was very concerned about, and he was in a good position to judge. He'd just spent 2 years in Europe. Doing the impossible. How do you get France, Germany, England, and the United States to work together against the Russian menace when we just fought our second major war with Germany. Ike did it, and I have to commend him for that. Not everybody could have done that. When you think about it, that's not an easy chore. We'd just been killing Germans, they'd been killing us, and suddenly we got to work together. So Ike asked that there be 3 committees set up in secret to meet. The name comes from, they were meeting at the White House solarium, sort of a special area, a sunroom and so forth, to each consider a different approach to containment of the Soviet Union. And they did that, and it was all done under high security. And that set American policy, literally for decades after that. And it's probably the reason that we avoided a nuclear war, frankly. A lot of people don't realize that we Earthlings have exploded 2,000 nuclear warheads. Only 2 on people, thank goodness. But 2,000 other ones. So it's not as if there was a shortage of nuclear weapons around.
Yeah, there's a YouTube video that's doing its rounds at the moment, and it starts off in, the early 40s when the first bomb was dropped, and it brings it right up to today, and it shows you all these thousands of bombs going off in little dots all around the world, and it's quite an amazing bit of footage because you don't realize how many of these things have actually been let off.
Yeah, it's true, and I've talked to people. Some people said, "Oh, you're kidding, Stan. What do you mean 2,000? Come on." Well, lying about nuclear weapons is nothing new, you understand. When the first one was set off at Trinity Site in New Mexico, July 16th, 1945, it was a big success, released the energy of 17,000 tons of TNT. Remember, a big weapon in 1944, a big bomb, released the energy of 10 tons of TNT. Anyway, it was seen from 100 miles away in New Mexico. Now, it was tested in New Mexico because there aren't many people around there. Weren't then, and there aren't really a lot now. Well, what did they do? They had to say something. People were calling the sheriff's office. What happened? Must have been a terrible explosion, fire, whatever. They put out a press release. An ammunition dump had blown up, and fortunately, nobody was injured.
And that press release was ready weeks before, obviously, right? They had prepared for...
I would presume so. Maybe somebody didn't think it would work. I don't know.
Well, staying on nuclear weapons, there's a famous quote that I've actually heard you say. I believe it was a documentary that I've seen probably over 15 years ago at this point. And this makes total sense. If we've been visited all throughout history, you have all these ancient civilizations talking about getting wisdom from the stars and so on and so forth. But yet, in the 40s, to now, we've had this huge surge of sightings and other activities, anomalous activities. And the way you said it is essentially when we let off that first nuclear explosion in the Trinity site in New Mexico in 1944 or 45, we essentially let the entire universe know that we are now a nuclear society. And the way you put it, if I'm not mistaken, was, the kids have found the matches. And that goes to show what primitive tribe we are in the sense that we discover nuclear power, and the first thing we do is develop a weapon with it. That's a pretty...
Well, of course. And remember, we went a step beyond that. I mentioned 10-ton bombs during the war, World War II. That was a big bomb, and they developed the B-29 especially to carry that, because you had to have a modified bomb bay and all kinds of stuff, because uranium is heavy and stuff. Anyway, we went on to go, our first fusion device, first bomb was fission, uranium and stuff for plutonium. We did both. In 52, we exploded our first H-bomb, released the energy of 10 million tons of TNT. And the Russians let off one a few years later, not many, 50 million tons of TNT. Now, there are 2 reasons for mentioning this. One is that aliens would realize this is a primitive society whose major activity is tribal warfare, and they're not nice people. I mean, it's bad enough during the war they destroyed 1,700 cities and killed 50 million people. And now they've got these monstrous bombs. But there's another part to that. When you have control of fusion, should you wish to go to the stars, you have a way to do it. Nuclear fusion produces almost all the energy in the universe. All the stars work by a nuclear fusion process, depending a little on the size of the star, which equations apply, but still. So we have joined the club of people who recognize that fusion is really the cat's meow. I mean, it's something special. And these idiots on Earth can come out and bother us if they want to, taking their brand of friendship. Everybody else calls it hostility, you realize. So times have changed, in other words. The perspective has changed. I think a major word involved in alien visitations is quarantine. And you've heard about the stories about the ICBM sites, like in Malmstrom Air Force Base, where a saucer shows up outside the gate, and then 10 nuclear-tipped missiles go offline, one after the other.
And they're all independently controlled.
What?
Robert Salas and his wife came on quite recently, and both, have come forward and said that they've also been abductees.
When you say both, I know Salas has come forth. Who's the other one?
His wife, Marilyn. She finally came forward and spoke about her ordeal. But the point I was saying is going back to when you were saying that the Maelstrom, the Air Force Base incident, those 10 nuclear ICBMs, according to Salas, they were individually controlled. You can't shut one off and a domino effect with all the other ones. Each one had to have been tampered with. So this UFO was targeting all of them. It's not like it just targeted one little area and set them all off. And that's what I thought was really interesting.
I think he sent a message, didn't they?
Yes, absolutely. And now we could look back and know that was not the only nuclear site they visited, right? We know Rendlesham had nuclear weapons there, and they were hovering near the weapon storage facilities. Do you know?
In the Soviet Union too, except there it was the other way around. They certainly went online instead of offline. That was pretty scary. Ready to launch unintentionally. What's going on here?
Can you tell us that story?
Say that again?
Can you tell us that story?
Well, I don't know a lot about it other than Salas talks about it. He'd heard it. The commander, I guess is the right word, of the base, suddenly gets informed that the missiles are hot, ready to roll. And that can't be, and they managed to shut them down. But it was kind of one of those scary moments, as you can imagine, for the people on site.
He had to take a life-or-death decision.
Yeah.
Basically, he took the humane decision to say, hold up a second, I have to look at the circumstances, the possibilities, and I know this is calling for the Queen and country, or in his case, the King and country, or the Tsar. But he took the decision to say it can't be real and said no. So he took a human decision. I think a lot of people that are, compartmentalized, they don't ask questions, they just do what they're told. They're the ones that frighten me, because I think if it had been on their watch, we would have been at war, But this general took a decision.
Right. Well, I think, too, we need to realize something else, going back to Bob Salas for a minute. The guys at missile launch sites, the guys who have their fingers on the button, so to speak, are carefully evaluated psychologically. It's strange duty. You're down in a hole there. You have tremendous responsibility. You can't avoid them. You can't take a day off, kind of thing. And they need to be psychologically adapted for that purpose. You don't want a guy who's going to lose his temper, who's going to take out a personal grudge with his finger on a button. No way, Jose.
And so the worst thing you want. You have one man that could essentially start a world war and end the planet as we know it.
Well, that's right. So what I'm getting at here is to go back to the original question. From an alien viewpoint, we're a bunch of idiots. And, I certainly don't need to tell anybody living in England that war is devastating. I'm glad I didn't have to go through what you guys went through. Although in my little school in Linden, New Jersey, we had some students from England. Their family sent them over during the war because they were concerned about the bombing and all the rest. And war is not fun. I worry about the people playing computer games, because everybody gets up and goes home. War is real, and it's hell. And it's one of the amazing feats of the last 70 years is that we haven't used any more nuclear weapons on people. Despite how many wars have we got going on, Korea and Vietnam and Syria and, you name it. They're all over the place. That's what worries me about Iran getting nuclear weapons, because I don't think they would show much restraint.
Going back to war in the UK, I remember asking my dad, because I was just after the war. I'm a sort of 60s baby, boomer baby. But I do remember asking my dad about the war, because I could never fathom why we were fighting our cousins and why our Queen had to change her name. I still don't today understand why we went to war twice with Germany. I can see a bigger picture, but it still doesn't make common sense to me how we could murder our cousins, our neighbours. And war for me is an atrocious thing, I resent war completely.
Well, I do too. And, like I say, I grew up through it, but fortunately I was in the United States and we didn't have to. We had air raid wardens, and we worried. I lived in a little town in New Jersey, and right on the coast, and we had a big oil refinery there that made 90% of the high-octane fuel used during World War II by the United States and Britain, too, for that matter. 90%. We were worried about German submarines coming along the coast and dropping a few shells and starting a huge fire and so forth. We were the end of the Big Inch pipeline from Texas that brought the raw crude up. Better than sending by ship, where it was subject to submarines and so forth. And so we worried about the war in the sense of air raid wardens and, close your drapes and keep your lights out and all kinds of things, drills. But it certainly had nothing, it didn't compare at all with what was going on in England. We never had a bomb dropped on the United States or a V-2 rocket or a V-1 rocket or any of these things. So I have great admiration, and my wife and I visited the Soviet Union a couple of years, 3 years ago, and we were in Leningrad. How did they hold off the Germans? They lost 1 million people in the siege of Leningrad. The winter helped, just as it helped defeat Napoleon, but thank goodness the Russians were holding them off. I don't know how they managed, frankly. Terrible losses. But the Russians lost more than 20 million people during the war. That's a lot of people.
It's really sad that 50 million people died as a result of the war, but we have to be thankful for the people that sacrificed their lives, because I fear that had the Russians not been able to hold off the Nazis in Leningrad, we might all be under Hitler's legacy's rule. And that would be, I think, even a more oppressive state than had we been under, say, communist rule.
No question. And I, being Jewish, there wouldn't have been any of us left if Hitler had won the war.
Well, I find it strange how, just a couple of years after the war, we then had Project Paperclip, where, Nazis were brought to America, to White Sands, von Braun and people like this. And then even today, a few years after the war, we then had the start-up of the CIA and the NSA, and these were the same German people that were from the Project Paperclip, that were at the backbone of the foundations of these two organizations, which are still today. So a lot of people say Germany just went underground,
Well, you remember the story was that our Germans are better than theirs, or the reason the Russians got into space before the Americans did. First satellite was Russian. The first animal in space was Russian. The first, I don't think they asked the animals for passports, but still, the first rocket that went around the moon was Russian. The United States was in deep trouble in terms of world prestige, and so I think we were trying to learn from flying saucers, and I think that's the role that Menzel played. People don't realize Menzel wrote a lot of science fiction. So he was skilled at putting together interesting but untrue scenarios. Like we can explain all the UFO sightings and stuff like that.
Yeah, one of the things was a documentary that the British brought out in the 70s, or the very late 70s, and it was called Alternative Free. And at that period, it was talking about an amalgamation of the American and the Russians working together for deep space. And at this particular time in the 70s, they were already showing what was like footage of the space shuttle, but the Russians. And so there was, in this documentary, I don't know if you're familiar with it, Mr. Friedman, but it was called Alternative Free.
I remember hearing the title Alternative 3, and I can't remember all the details. I'm getting old, we lose some of it, and we don't use it very much, stories like that. Well, it is remarkable. Remember, we and the Russians had joint space shots? That's a remarkable development, and I'm very glad for it, because if we're going to go any place out there, we should be going as Earthlings, Terrans, whatever you want.
We're all on the same mothership.
Yes.
Yeah, because, look, the United Nations does not allow representation from individual cities, at least the last time I checked they didn't. Why would the Galactic Federation allow individual countries on a dumb little planet, because there seem to be loads of planets out there, something I wouldn't have said 60 years ago, but I can say now. Good estimate, there are several billion planets in our own galaxy. Frank Drake of the SETI program, Silly Effort to Investigate, that's what SETI stands for, at one point was saying there might be 8,000 places in the galaxy that could send signals. A better number now would be 8 billion, which makes us much less significant. But it also seems to me, since we're talking about the Earth being 4.5 or so billion years old and stars older than that around and so forth, it hardly seems likely that we're the most advanced. So it would seem that there's probably been a lot of interstellar travel, a lot of checking things out. And, you have to find another place to go in case you have an asteroid mess up your planet, in case there's a plague, in case there's a nuclear war, whatever. You need to be ready with alternatives. Alternatives. 2, 3, 4, 5. And so if that's the situation, that is, that there's loads of guys out there, somebody must have decided that we have to keep track of the primitives in the neighborhood who show signs of not being able to control themselves. Every society, its major reason, presumably, for a government is to protect the welfare of the people and the security of the people. So I think everybody out there is saying, okay, we got to keep tabs on the primitives in the neighborhood, but only close tabs on those primitives who show signs of being able to bother us. And you can't wait till they get out here with their nasty weapons. You got to try to say, hold it, fellas, get your act together first. We don't want you out here. And so, in today's world, where young people keep saying, surely we're not the only ones, they've heard about the Kepler satellite results.
I'm glad you brought that up. Let's keep going on that, because that's a very, very important thing. As I was saying last time, I said this again, I think with you on air on the other show, and of course with Kathleen Martin again, anybody who is 18 years or younger was born after extraterrestrial planets were found and after Goldilocks planets were found. Anybody who's 22 years or younger was taught in kindergarten or forward that planets exist outside our solar system. When I was in grade school, I was sure taught that there's nothing out there, that just stars and gas and dust and other stuff. So obviously things are dramatically changed. The number, the percentage of the youngsters that believe and have open minds that we are not the only ones is staggering. And that's why I'm hoping that we are finally moving in a direction where we've been at a standstill for decades.
Well, let's hope so. And the thing is, when I talk about aliens, I think they're looking over the place, trying to make sure we don't do anything stupid like come out and bother them. And, you know, it is an interesting question. Why didn't we go to the moon after Apollo 17? 18 and 19 were built. Crews were selected. Nixon said it would cost too much money. And I'm wondering whether some alien didn't say, hey, buddy, stay off our moon. We don't want you guys.
There's that movie that came out recently, the Transformer movies, where Buzz Aldrin takes a lead role in it in the beginning, where they say, right, we're dark on the moon, meaning that, you know, the satellites behind them, they're going to lose signal to the Earth for a while, so they've got this opportunity. And, you know, I always remember the old Father Christmas statement from I think it was Neil Armstrong, and conspiracy people would say that was a key word, that there were UFOs up there. And then when you see the actual scene from this Transformers movie, what do you see? You see a big UFO right on the edge of a crater. And I found that quite sort of ironic, that a man that's been to the moon would take such a role and project that, unless he was sort of letting out the secret. You know, I think Neil Armstrong said just before he died that, you know, there's a lot that's been undone and unsaid, and it would come out. It was a sort of secret line, not secret, but it was a sort of a cryptid speech that he made before he died. And I wondered if that Buzz Aldrin scene was part of their relinquish, you know?
Let me add one thing to that, Mr. Friedman, in case you haven't seen that movie. Buzz Aldrin not only played himself in that movie as the second man on the moon who encountered ETs, but he played it as a serious role. I mean, the movie could be comical, it could be argued as a children's movie, but when his role, his reactions in there, he wasn't joking when he was speaking of any of this. And it makes you wonder. It's like, why would the man on Apollo 11 play in a fictional movie and discuss extraterrestrials on the moon? And that's just what hit me the most. He doesn't need the money. He doesn't need the fame. He's already got it.
Well, I'll tell you, I've done 2 television shows with Buzz Aldrin. There were other people there, too. I'm not trying to make a partnership between me and Buzz. But he certainly wasn't admitting to aliens on the moon then. Now, maybe times have changed. And I spent some time with Bill Anders, another astronaut. He was on the first flight that went around the moon but didn't land, manned flight. Anders, Borman, and Lovell, I guess, were the crew. And we were each chairing a session at a meeting of the American Nuclear Society many years ago, late 60s. And we got to talking about UFOs. Well, at first I asked him, I said, Bill, I've heard stories about the astronauts having had sightings. What can you tell me? He answered in a very careful fashion. Well, I don't think there was anything that we couldn't identify. And my strong feeling was I just touched on something classified. That he didn't want to lie to me, but he was being very cautious. You know, more cautious than seemed to be appropriate. And the funny thing is, I was going to be giving a lecture somewhere. I was working for Westinghouse, so I was giving a lecture on the trip home. And I had some of my books and stuff, not ones that I had written, but other books about UFOs with me. And he bought copies of everything I had. So it was great interest. And I found out more about astronaut sightings from the Condon report, which came out later, than from Bill, which to me meant he later became chairman of General Dynamics, I believe. Very sharp. All the astronauts were sharp guys, certainly Buzz included. They weren't just pilots, in other words. They had to have the right stuff, whatever that fancy term means.